Hello everyone and welcome to another Endgame episode with Coach B from masterchess.com. In today's video, we will go over endgames with opposite color bishops and separated pawns by two files. In the first video on this topic, we looked at three obvious drawing scenarios that everybody needs to know when dealing with this type of endgames. In this video, we will look at all the positions with pawns being separated by two files that do not belong to those three drawing scenarios. Knowledge about these important positions will help you be able to apply these resources even with more pawns on the board. So let's get started. As a general rule, with two pawns separated by two files, if those pawns are both on bishop's files, they usually win. With the pawn on the center file and a pawn on the knight file, the ending is usually drawn. However, winning chances arise when the pawn on the knight's file is not much advanced and the attacking bishop has control over the promotion square. With the central pawn and a pawn on the rook's file, the ending is drawn. So in this first position, we have two pawns that are both on bishop files, so the game should be a win. The winning procedure is usually the same for all these type of endgames. While the bishop defends the pawns, the king will try to penetrate to support the pawn which is blocked by the defending bishop. Drawing can happen in these scenarios if you are able to stop the invading king, or if the bishop's diagonal creates a blockade covering the squares of the advance of both pawns and has the king's support, as we've seen in the first video. However, in this video, we will not deal with that drawing scenario as we've covered in the first video. So in this first position, it's white to play and white is winning. The correct first move is moving the pawn to f4, blocking the path of the bishop from reaching the h2 to b8 diagonal, which controls both pawns. From here, black will respond with bishop to h4, and now king to d5. White is trying to penetrate the position with the king to support the pawn on the f file to march forward. After this, black will respond with bishop to d8, then king to e6, bishop to h4, pawn to f5, king to d8, pawn to f6. And now the black king is blocked from trying to prevent the push on the f file. After this, black can respond with bishop to g5, king to f5, attacking the bishop, bishop to h6, king to g6, bishop to f8, king to f7, bishop to h6, and after king to g8, white secures the squares f7 and f8 for the pawn on the f file to march forward. After something like king to c7, pawn to f7, king to d8, white will promote and black will lose the game. Coming back from the beginning, I do want to mention that after f4 and bishop to h4, no better is here to try to get the king on the other side. The king to d8 and king to e6, white is still preventing the black king from getting to the pawn on the f file. And a similar play will continue. And I'm just going to fast forward through the moves. And here, white will still win the game. So in conclusion, two pawns on the bishop files win unless the position belongs to the second drawing scenario, as we've seen in the first video, where the bishop controls the diagonal of both pawns and has support from the king for the blockade. Next, we're going to take a look at the position where we have a pawn on the central file and a knight file. In this scenario, the ending is drawn if the defending king controls the central pawn, while his bishop controls the promotion square for the pawn on the knight file. This position is a little bit more complex, and I encourage you to practice it on my website, masterchess.com, especially that this position occurs quite frequently. In this position, it's white to move, and the correct continuation is moving the king to e2, cutting out the black's king from the central pawn. After this, black can respond with pawn to b3, and now king to d1, a very important move. White is still preventing the black king from reaching the central pawn together with the bishop, while also covering the c1 square, which is a very important square, as we will see in a little bit. Coming back, if white fails to do that, then let's say he makes a waiting move here with bishop to g6, he's going to lose this game. And I'm just going to fast forward to the correct continuation. After black reaches the square c1, he's simply going to be able to march the pawn, promoting it to a queen, and white will have to sacrifice this bishop, losing the game. So coming back, the correct response is moving the king to d1. After this, black doesn't have many options. He can either try to move the king to b2 towards the square a1, supporting the push on the b file, or he can go with the king to b4 to go around the pawn to support that push. But neither of those will be successful, as we will see in this video. So after king to b2, here white will move the bishop to e6. And now the black king cannot march towards the square a1, as the bishop will simply capture that pawn. So here he's going to have to move out of the way. He doesn't want to move the king to a2 as the pawn is pinned. So he's going to try king to a3. And now bishop to f5. If the pawn marches to b2, here's another key move, bishop to b1. And this is the reason why white is able to draw this game with the knight pawn, as the bishop on b1 covers the square a2 and c2, and the black king cannot make any progress to support his pawn. After something like king to b3, king to e2, king to c3, bishop to e4. And the black king is blocked and cannot make any progress. If he goes back to b3, then bishop to b1, repeating the position, and black cannot make any progress. Coming back, we looked at king to b2. If the black king tries to go around the pawn with king to b4, well, after this, the white bishop just needs to wait on the same diagonal, so he could simply back it off with bishop to h7. And he's just going to wait until black threatens to occupy the a1 square. After king to a3, bishop to g6. And no matter what black tries here, he's not going to be able to make any progress. If he tries king to a2, well, here white will simply pin the pawn. After bishop to e5, king to e2. Bishop to d4, king to d1. King to a3, getting out of the pin, bishop to g6. And here black cannot make any progress. Coming back, we looked at king to a2. If black tries pushing the pawn here to b2, well, we've seen that after bishop to b1, the black king is caught away from the square a1, and he cannot come and chase the bishop away to support his pawn. After king to b3, king to e2, and black cannot make any progress. And coming back, the only other try that we haven't mentioned is king to b2. After this, since black is threatening moving the king to a1, the bishop needs to attack the pawn on a3. So bishop to f7. This will prevent the black king from going to a1, as he's simply going to capture that pawn. And now black cannot make any progress. King to a2, bishop to e6, keeping that pawn pinned. King to a3, getting out of the pin, bishop to f5. And we can see that this simply repeats. So eventually black will push the pawn to b2, and after bishop to b1, black cannot make any progress. Coming back, I do want to mention that when the white bishop keeps the pin on b3, and after the black king gets out of that pin, here white really needs to move the bishop to f5. Coming back, if he fails to do that, and let's say he's just going to make another waiting move here, bishop to f7, he's actually going to lose this game, because now the pawn will march to b2, being ready to promote on the next move, so the bishop needs to cover the promotion square with bishop to g6, but now the king can march to a2. If the bishop will attack the king with bishop to f7 check, the king has reached the a1 square, and now white has lost the game. After bishop to g6, the pawn will promote, white will have to sacrifice the bishop, losing the game. However, coming back, after black gets out of the pin with king to a3, if the white bishop will move on f5, covering the promotion square, black cannot make any progress. We saw that pushing the pawn to b2 will allow the bishop to go to b1, keeping the black king away. And black has no other options. In this next position, again we're dealing with the central pawn and a pawn on a knight file. However, this position is different because the defending bishop does not cover the promotion square. Also, the pawn on the knight file is not as further advanced. And we will see that white is able to win this position even if it's black to move. So here, after something like bishop to f1, white can play bishop to c5. After bishop to c4, bishop to e3, putting black in Zugzwang. Here, black has to allow the advance of one of white's pawns, and it doesn't matter which one moves first. Here, black only has two options, keeping the bishop on the same diagonal preventing the push on e6, or moving the bishop on b5, preventing the pawn on the b file to move forward. But neither of those will succeed. And before I move forward, I do want to mention that if the black king would be on e6 here, blocking the central pawn, he would be able to draw this game. However, with the king on d7, he's not going to be able to do that. If he's going to keep the bishop on the same diagonal, let's say bishop to d5, what's going to happen is the pawn on the b file will march forward. So pawn to b5. After bishop to c4, pawn to b6. Bishop to d5. Here, white will move the bishop to d2. A very excellent move. The white bishop is heading towards the a5 square, where he will be attacking the square c7. So when the pawn will march to b7, the pawn will cover the square c8, making a blockade for the black king not to be able to get to the pawn. So after something like king to c6, then bishop to a5. King to d7, pawn to e6 check. Another excellent move. If the king will go to c8 to prevent the pawn on the b file to march forward, white will simply march with the pawn to e7. After something like bishop to c6, covering the promotion square, white will continue with king to f7. Bishop to d7 will be met with king to f8. After bishop to c6, white will promote the pawn, and black will have to sacrifice the bishop, losing the game. Coming back, I do want to mention that after king to c8 and pawn to e7, no batter is moving the king to d7. Here, white can simply let the pawn on the b file go, so he can march the pawn to b7. After the bishop takes that pawn, white will move the king to f7. After bishop to d5 check and king to f8, white secures the promotion square. The only square that prevents the pawn from marching is the square f7, while he will lose the bishop and also the game. Coming back, after bishop to a5 and king to d7, pawn to e6, I do want to mention that here taking the pawn on e6 is not going to be any better. After bishop takes the pawn on e6, here white can simply march the pawn to b7. And we could see the pawn together with the bishop create a wall so that the black king cannot get to the pawn. After something like king to c6, the pawn will still promote and white will win the game. Coming back to the Zugzwang position, we saw what happens when black is going to keep the bishop on the same diagonal. So let's take a look what happens if he's trying to block the pawn on the b file. So after bishop to b5 here, white will simply march the pawn to e6 check. After king to e8, king to e5. King to e7, bishop to g5 check. King to e8, and now king to d6. Breaking through into black's camp. After bishop to c4, pawn to e7. Bishop to d3, king to c5. King to d7, pawn to b5. The white king is now supporting the pawn on the knight file to march forward. After bishop to e2, pawn to b6. Bishop to f3, king to d4. Once both pawns have reached their limit, the white king will now try to get to the f8 square or to the d6 square to push the black king back. After something like king to e8, king to e5. King to d7, king to f6. And now there's only two options that black has, trying to prevent the white king from reaching the f8 square, or trying to prevent the white king from reaching the d6 square. If he moves the bishop to h5, white will simply march towards the f8 square. He's going to move the king to g7. If black will attack the pawn on the b file with king to c6, white will simply retreat the bishop, protecting that pawn. After king to d7, king to f8. After something like bishop to g4, another excellent move, bishop to d2, trying to go towards the square a5 to create that blockade as we've seen before. After king to c6, bishop to a5. King to d7, pawn to b7, creating a blockade for the black king, not being able to push through. After bishop to f3, the pawn will promote and white will win the game. And coming back to this position, we looked at moving the bishop to h5. If instead, black will move the king to e8, not letting the white king go towards the f8 square, white will simply march with the king to e6. After bishop to e4, king to d6, bishop to f3, the king has reached c7, and white is totally winning. After something like bishop to g2, white will simply march the pawn forward, black will have to sacrifice the bishop, and then white will win the game. And the last scenario, where the pawns are separated by two files, includes a pawn on the central file and a pawn on the rook file. This type of endgame, it's always a draw with the correct defense setup. The only way to win here is if the white king will be able to reach the b7 square. However, this will be impossible. There is no way on the left side. The space between the pawns is too narrow. Therefore, the only route that is available is on the right side around the pawn. However, black is not going to let him achieve that. And if you're playing black here, you want to make sure that you prevent the white king from reaching the square e8. Even though defense is still possible even in that case, it is a lot more challenging. So here, after king to f5, the correct response will be king to e7, blocking the white king from reaching the square e8. After king to e5, bishop to b8 check, king to d4, bishop to a7 check, king to c4, king to d6, preventing the white king from getting in between the pawns. After king to b5, the bishop can simply retreat with bishop to f2, as the black king together with the bishop create a wall preventing the white king from penetrating through. And white cannot make any progress, and a draw is achieved. Thank you for watching my video, and I encourage you to visit my website masterchess.com, where you will be able to practice these positions against the computer. All you need to do is click on Endgame versus Computer, opposite color bishops, and then you can go to the separated pawns and play against the computer. Thank you and have a great day.